Now, the next important character after Charles Martel is his son, and his son's name is Pepin. And he's known as Pepin the Short because he was not very tall. He was a short guy, and he became mayor in 741. This was called the Mayor of the Palace, and he appealed to Pope Zacharias to grant him title as kin. And then Bishop Boniface crowned him in 751 AD. So he's after, of course, Charles Martel stops the Muslims at the Battle of Tours in 732. So roughly 20 years later, he becomes king, okay? And then later, the Pope was threatened by Lombards. So Pepin, of course, supports the Pope, and the popes are crowning him. So this is one of the things that the church did back then, is they were so involved in secular, the civil government, is that they actually crowned these kings, and they crowned him as well. So he's threatened by the Lombards. The Lombards are a tribe that comes with the invasion of all those barbarian tribes that come down into Rome in the empire. The Lombards threaten Rome. And so now we have Pepin, who helps defend the church. And so Pepin takes, I'm just going to put a P here, Pepin takes troops, some of the Franks, to help defend the Pope, okay? And so this is what happens after he defends Rome, or the Pope. You can see how now the ruler of the Franks here is closely allied with the Pope. He's like a big ally. So we're going to put down he's allied with the Pope. And this is how these kings of Europe became more and more connected. Okay. Now, what happens is when he is crowned, Pepin begins the Carolingian dynasty. Okay, so it's the Carolingian dynasty. And Pepin is now a Carolingian ruler. So these were just different houses of Europe ruling over this particular case. These are ruling over the Franks, which later becomes France. So Martel and before him Clovis were Merovingian. That was the dynasty. And now this is the Carolingian dynasty. Okay? And so he takes the title when he is defender of Rome. He takes a new title, and they call him the Patrician, which means the father of Rome. So it's kind of an honorary title because he's a defender of the Pope. Now we come to Charlemagne, and Charlemagne is the most famous one. He is Pepin's son. So Pepin's son is Charlemagne. And it's just Charlemagne, Magna, you can see Magna, the Great, and Charla means Charles. So Charles the Great, and they just give him more of a French name, Charlemagne. And he takes the throne, he becomes king in 768 AD. Now he's really famous because he extends the kingdom of the Franks. They call this the Frankish kingdom. And to such an extent, it is just bigger than even today's France. Now, you might say, well, that's not, what's the big deal there? Well, France is the largest country in Europe, okay? And this is now the largest empire since Rome, okay? And so he is this vast area, which includes all of France today, plus Belgium, plus Holland, plus some of Germany, kind of a small part of Germany, and all of Switzerland. So this is a pretty amazing realm, especially when you consider that Charlemagne had no telephone, they had no mail system. He basically was in the saddle fighting battles. If I'm remembering, I think he had some astronomical number of campaigns that he had to fight to hold this empire together, something like 60 different campaigns. But he was constantly in the saddle, and he rode all over his empire personally to have this rule. So for one person to maintain an empire like this is very, very amazing. So Charlemagne was kind of an extraordinary figure. And what he did is Charlemagne forced Christianity, because, of course, he was a defender of Rome, the Pope, and he forces Christianity on his conquered people. So all these conquered tribes and peoples, he forces Christianity. Of course, we know that that's not a good way. Christianity is a religion where it's not forced, but people decide. They have a conversion, see. And he especially forces this on the German Saxons. So the Saxons of Germany. And there's actually an area of Germany called Saxony, and this is where the Saxons are from. So he's forcing all these tribes to submit to him, and he does this for actually 50 years. He had 50 years of war that he waged to hold this empire together. And they consider this empire is considered as the revived, or the come to life again, Roman Empire. Now, why is that? Well, it's under one man's rule, and there's a lot of peace. Charlemagne was a good ruler. There's a large area under rule, and because of that, it's kind of similar to what period of Roman rule from 30 BC to 180 AD. Do y'all remember? Yes, probably remember the Pax Romana, right? So it's very similar to the Pax Romana. Not the same, and of course it's not as big. It was not as big an empire as Rome. But when you consider one man put it all together and kind of ruled over it by himself, it's pretty amazing. So let's put down here that Charlemagne's rule is similar to the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And again, that was from 30 BC to 180 AD. It was 210 years of peaceful rule, no major wars during the Roman Empire. So, what happened in 800 AD, a new pope, Pope Leo, decides to crown Charlemagne. and he crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, so he was going to be the first, basically the first Holy Roman Emperor. And this is quite an event. Now, at this point, Charlemagne is baptized. So he's baptized in 800, and they consider that this is the start of what we call the Holy Roman Empire, which is an empire. It's a group of, in this case, these would be the future France and these other kingdoms that protect the Pope and honor Christianity. So Europe, this big area, is unified, but this unity is short-lived. It doesn't last long. In fact, when Charlemagne dies, his sons take his empire is divided between his three sons. So there's three sons, three separate empires that come out of this. Now, this is similar to what that we studied. Do you all remember Alexander, right? Alexander, a great warring general, and almost immediately after he's died, his empire gets split between four major rulers into four major sections. So he forces Christianity, and this doesn't last either. Within 100 years, Europe is broken in to like 100 tiny kingdoms. So in about 100 years, by 900 AD, Europe is nothing but tiny kingdoms. So there's no Carolingian Empire remaining. But there's lots of little kingdoms, and this idea of an empire and an emperor that will protect Rome, this persists. Okay, so there's a great power struggle. There's a power struggle that ensues. See, before with Charlemagne, it was kind of settled. There was one big Western empire called France. The Franks ruled over it. And now this is all broken apart, so there's a power struggle. And this is between really the church, the Roman Church with the Pope, and these states. Okay? And the Vikings from Northern Europe, the Vikings attack. They are particularly prevalent from 900 on, and so they've come to pillage and destroy and loot these cities. And so these cities are building fortresses now, and they're trying to protect themselves from the Vikings. Also, you have the Magyars. Now, the Magyars are a people from the east, from an area called Hungary, modern state called Hungary. And then the Moors are also attacking. The Moors attack from North Africa. So they're attacking mostly in Spain, but they also go some other areas as well in their attack on Christianity. Of course, the Moors are Muslim. Okay, so you want to remember they're Muslims that are followers of Muhammad, and they're promoting this big Arab empire as well. So during all this time now, we have feudalism grips Europe. It's a system of authority, and it's a system that has a structure to it based on control of the land and ownership of the land. So you could say that the land is being controlled by the lords, and then the common people, the serfs, are farming the land. And so we have a feudal arrangement. And so that's what Europe looks like. And that's really what Cedric of Rotherwood is. He's controlling a section of the land, and he has a built-up kind of fortress at Rotherwood, and he's protecting himself and from Normans who raid, and there's all kinds of robbers, and there's chaos, and so these people are trying to unite under a feudal lord, someone who will protect them. So feudalism is now the way of life, and it stays true in Europe all the way from about 800 to about 1300 AD. And then you're starting to see these larger nations that are taking root. Now, on your sheet that you have, that you should have been given, you should be looking at it right now, as a matter of fact, for your notes, there's a timeline. And there's a timeline 491, Clovis, which is the beginning of the Frankish Empire. He was, this is the Merovingian Empire. You can see there's the rise of Islam all through the 500s and 600s. Then Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours. Pepin the Short is crowned king by Boniface. Feudalism dominates Europe. Now the date there says 800 to 1200. Let's stay with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. It does go a little bit later than that, but yeah, let's just stay. It's easy to make that little change. So 800 to 1200. And then, right about the time that feudalism begins to make some change, and it starts, you start to get into some of the larger nations, the Crusades are taking place from 1100 to 1300. Now, there's a second sheet, a handout that came with your notes, and it talks about the fall of Rome and the fall of the Roman Empire in the upper part of the page. We've covered that. We've talked about it. I've just written a summary, so I'm going to put a little line here and talk about here to know this summary of the fall of Rome. So be familiar with that. Be able to explain what are some of the things that brought on this fall of Rome. And we talked about laziness, very little unity. The empire was held together by force, the legions, and by violence, and that's not things that will hold together an empire very long. And there's great wealth that the Romans had, so they had a lot of slavery. You could add slavery to that list because their culture became very pleasure-seeking, and they had the slaves do most of the work while they indulged in overeating and entertainment and games. In some ways, that's kind of frightening because that's what we see in America. We see a lot of people overindulging in pleasure and entertainment. And then we also state here that the Romans at some point didn't even choose to fight the invaders anymore. They stood back and let the barbarians come into Rome. So we enter with the fall of the Roman Empire. We have the Middle Ages. And so I'm going to ask you to write on your sheet now, the Middle Ages are from 500, roughly 476, the fall of Rome, all the way to about 1500 AD. And the first part of the Middle Ages was called the Dark Ages. And this was because of so much violence. Dark Ages were about 500 to about 800 AD. And it's characterized by violence and chaos all the things that we've talked about with the barbarians running around, attacking and causing great loss among the people. So we want to make sure that we understand that this was a very difficult time in Europe. In fact, this was the fall of Rome was, they thought the world was ending. I mean, a lot of people look for the second coming of Jesus then because it was so terrible. People starving, people not losing all that they had, and this major power that had made security and peace in Europe was now shattered, and the barbarians just running wild, doing anything they wanted throughout what was known as the Roman Empire. So a terrible time, terrible time. We're going to stop here as we go to our next and our final section of history.